Congresswoman, are you prepared to answer for your inconsistencies? The words cracked through the chamber like the crack of a gavel, Judge Amul Thapar's voice dripping with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Cameras zoomed in, the flashbulbs stung the eyes of those closest to the front row, and a restless murmur rippled across the room. It wasn't just a question. It was a trap, meticulously laid, sharp-edged, designed to corner Jasmine Crockett before she could even open her mouth. The air was heavy with expectation. A hush fell, not of respect, but of tension, the kind that makes every heartbeat louder. Spectators leaned forward in their chairs. Journalists clutched their pens, waiting for a stumble, a hesitation, a sign that the young congresswoman was out of her depth against the seasoned judge. The setting itself felt stacked against her. Dark wood panels, looming portraits of past authority, a stage meant for intimidation. And yet, at the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett sat still. Her face was unreadable, her posture unwavering, her eyes locked, not on the crowd, not on the flashing cameras, but squarely on the man across from her. Where most would fidget or falter, she radiated an almost disarming calm. Thapar leaned forward, sensing advantage. His tone sharpened, slicing the silence. "Isn't it true that your record contradicts your own words?" Another murmur rolled. Across the chamber, louder this time, the audience intoxicated by the scent of a potential takedown. For a moment, it felt as though the gavel had already struck, as though her credibility was being dismantled in real time. But Crockett didn't flinch, not a blink, not a twitch. The cameras caught her in near stillness, as if she were carved from stone, as if every ounce of her energy was waiting for the exact moment to strike. The composure itself became a statement, louder than any words she might have rushed to offer. The tension was unbearable. Some in the audience smirked, convinced they were about to witness a defeat. Others shifted uneasily, sensing something they couldn't yet name, and then with the nation holding its breath, the seconds stretched into eternity. What looked like silence was, in truth, the calm before a storm. But in less than 60 seconds, the tables would turn, and Judge Thapar would never recover. This was no ordinary hearing. It wasn't a procedural formality tucked away in some quiet corner of Washington. It was a spectacle, one that had been teased for weeks, hyped by headlines, and cable news tickers that framed it as a clash of ideals, a battle for narrative control. Judge Amul Thapar, with his reputation for sharp questioning and unflinching demeanor, was expected to seize the moment and reassert dominance for his camp. To many, this was his stage, his chance to remind America that power still belonged to the old guard, to those who wield authority like a weapon. The stakes were bigger than the individuals at the table. Beneath the polished wood and scripted decorum, this was a fight over identity and legitimacy. In the eyes of millions watching from their living rooms and phones, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another congresswoman. She represented the rising tide of voices too often dismissed. Women of color, children of immigrants, ordinary citizens who had clawed their way into spaces that once felt impenetrable. Her presence was itself an act of defiance. That's why Thapar's strategy mattered. He wasn't simply questioning a record, he was performing for an audience eager to see Crockett stumble, to validate their belief that dignity and persistence could never outmatch pedigree and power. Every word he aimed at her was sharpened with the weight of that expectation. His allies had whispered it openly. This was the moment to put her in her place, and the media played along. In the days leading up to the hearing, talk shows ran segments with analysts smirking about Crockett's lack of experience. Editorials speculated how she might handle the pressure. Even memes circulated online, mocking her chances. On Twitter, hashtags trended, Showdown with Thapar, a Crockett on the hot seat. The digital noise created an atmosphere of inevitability, as if her defeat was already scripted, a matter of time. But there was another side to the story. In barber shops, in crowded diners, in immigrant households across the country, people were talking about her differently. They saw themselves in her, the accent in her voice, the grit in her posture, the refusal to bow even when the odds tilted against her. Social media threads buzzed with support. She doesn't just speak for herself, she speaks for all of us. If she stands tall in there, maybe we all can. Clips of her past speeches resurfaced, gathering momentum, building a sense that something greater was brewing beneath the surface. Still, the weight of the moment was undeniable. The chamber had been arranged like a theater, with Thapar cast as the seasoned actor and Crockett as the supposed understudy who had been thrust into a role too big for her. It was supposed to be his show of authority, his reminder to the nation that challengers could be humbled when they strayed too far into the lion's den. He had every advantage: the setting, the reputation, the anticipation, and for the first few minutes it seemed to play out exactly as scripted. He pressed her with questions that dripped with condescension. The commentators nodded knowingly, whispering predictions of her collapse. The murmurs in the gallery grew, a chorus of disbelief that anyone could withstand this pressure. But something was off. Those who looked closely noticed her stillness, the way she absorbed each question without flinching, without rushing to defend herself. It was the stillness of someone who wasn't cornered at all, but calculating. Everyone expected Crockett to fold under the pressure, but they were wrong. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand the man behind the gavel. Judge Amul Thapar wasn't some obscure figure suddenly thrust into the spotlight. For years, his name carried weight in conservative legal circles. Appointed to the federal bench, celebrated by the Federalist Society, and often whispered about. As a future Supreme Court contender, Thapar cultivated the image of a man untouchable. A jurist who combined razor-sharp intellect with the confidence of someone who never questioned his place in the hierarchy. His reputation was built on precision. He had a way of framing questions that felt less like inquiries and more like cross-examinations. Lawyers who appeared before him described the sensation as being trapped under a floodlight, every answer scrutinized, every hesitation magnified. In the courtroom, that style carried authority. He was feared, admired, and envied all at once. But there was another side to this reputation, one that lingered in the stories of those less enamored by his stature. His sharpness often blurred into intimidation. Colleagues recalled the way he'd lean into witnesses, his words carrying an edge that made them sound less like questions and more like accusations. The press, when covering his more controversial moments, noted how he seemed to relish those exchanges, as though breaking down an opponent wasn't just part of the job, it was part of his identity. That pattern had earned him both loyal defenders and fierce critics. To his admirers, it was proof of strength. Here was a man who didn't back down, who could cut through nonsense with surgical precision. To his detractors, it was arrogance disguised as rigor, a man so convinced of his superiority that he mistook intimidation for brilliance, and now that very style was on display in the chamber. Thapar didn't simply ask Crockett questions, he aimed them like darts, expecting them to land with devastating impact. He projected the same confidence he had wielded countless times before, certain that his reputation alone would tilt the balance in his favor. The trap wasn't just in the words. It was in the performance, the raised brow, the clipped tone, the pregnant pauses that dared his target to fill the silence. But here's where the cracks began to show. His confidence, once a mark of discipline, had hardened into something more brittle. He had grown so accustomed to opponents shrinking under his gaze that he no longer considered the possibility of resistance. His questions, once sharp, now carried a whiff of predictability. The rhythm of his interrogation revealed the assumptions he made, assumptions that his target would stumble, would defer, would cower. Observers who had studied him closely noticed it too. Behind the polished veneer, there was a growing reliance on intimidation as a shortcut, a crutch for moments when substance might not be enough. He had honed the art of rattling nerves, but what if the person across from him couldn't be rattled? What if stillness met sharpness, calm met arrogance? The weapon he trusted most would suddenly lose its power. And beneath the chamber's theatrics lay another truth. Thapar's style, while effective in courtrooms where he held ultimate authority, did not translate as seamlessly in the public square. Here, cameras were rolling, millions were watching, and every flash of arrogance could be clipped, shared, memed, and dissected in real time. Intimidation loses some of its edge when the audience starts rooting for the one being targeted. Still, Thapar pressed on, unaware of the shift. For him, this was routine. Another target, another moment to showcase his dominance. He didn't see the stillness across from him for what it was, not uncertainty, but preparation. He didn't recognize that his opponent wasn't blinking because she wasn't afraid. He didn't realize that what had worked 100 times before was about to collapse in front of millions. And so he doubled down. Each question carried more bite. Each pause lingered longer, as though sheer persistence would force a crack. But persistence built on arrogance is a dangerous thing. It blinds you to the storm forming just beyond your gaze. The truth is, Amul Thapar wasn't wrong to believe in the weight of his reputation. It had carried him far, earned him respect, even fear. But reputations, like weapons, dull over time, when used without care. And in that chamber, in that moment, his most trusted weapon, intimidation, was about to fail him in spectacular fashion, and yet the very arrogance that built his reputation would be the spark of his undoing. Long before Jasmine Crockett's name echoed in congressional chambers or trended across social media feeds, she was simply a young woman with grit in her bones and justice on her mind. Her story didn't begin with privilege or pedigree. It began in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, where the margins of survival demanded resilience, and where the very notion of public service was less about ambition and more about necessity. She came of age in a world that often told women like her to sit down, to lower their voice, to wait their turn. But Crockett never learned the art of shrinking. From the beginning, she understood that silence was complicity, and she had no intention of being silent. She studied relentlessly, working jobs that demanded every ounce of her energy while keeping her eyes fixed on a bigger horizon. For her, education wasn't just a personal achievement. It was a weapon, a shield, a ladder out of the limitations others had designed for her. Law school sharpened her edges. She didn't step into those halls with the comfort of legacy connections or inherited influence. Instead, she carried with her the stories of those who never made it past the courthouse steps, people chewed up by a system too big to fight alone. When she opened her case books, she saw more than doctrine. She saw the stakes of real lives, families, and futures. That lens would shape every decision she made. Her legal career became a frontline battle. While others sought corporate law firms and cushy partnerships, Crockett walked into courtrooms on behalf of those society too often abandoned. She defended the poor, the marginalized, the accused who lacked the resources to fight back. To her, every client was more than a case file. They were the embodiment of a principle she held sacred, that justice was either for all or it wasn't justice at all. This work wasn't glamorous. The pay was modest. The hours long, the victories hard-fought, but every grueling day etched resilience into her character. She learned to face down seasoned prosecutors with little more than her preparation and her conviction. She learned to absorb the sneers, the dismissals, the whispered doubts. And she learned something even more powerful, that composure in the face of hostility was its own kind of strength. That composure became her signature. When voices rose against her, she steadied her own. When doors slammed in her face, she pushed them open again. And when the political establishment underestimated her, as they so often did, she used their doubt as fuel. Each campaign she ran was an uphill climb. Money was tight, networks were limited, and critics were plentiful. But Crockett never mistook hardship for defeat. She wore it like armor. Her victories weren't accidents. They were the fruit of persistence. She knocked on doors when volunteers were scarce. She shook hands until her palms ached. She spoke in community centers, in churches, in crowded living rooms where people were hungry to see someone who looked like them, who understood their struggles, who spoke their language of survival and dignity. Every time she walked into those rooms, she wasn't selling herself as a politician. She was embodying a promise that the halls of power didn't belong exclusively to the powerful, and people believed her, not because she was perfect, but because she was real. They saw in her a reflection of their own frustrations, their own hopes. When she stood tall, they stood taller. When she refused to back down, they remembered the times they too had been told to yield, and they felt vindicated in her defiance. Her rise to Congress was improbable, a testament to the fact that persistence could outmatch privilege. Critics dismissed her as too inexperienced, too outspoken, or too unpolished. But the very qualities they mocked became the foundation of her connection with the people she served. Crockett didn't traffic in political jargon or hollow platitudes. She spoke with clarity, with passion, with the unmistakable cadence of truth. And now, sitting in that chamber across from Judge Amul Thapar, all of that history lived in her stillness. Every trial she had fought for the voiceless, every uphill campaign she had clawed through, every dismissal she had turned into determination, it all converged in this moment. The cameras didn't just capture her silence, they captured decades of resilience honed in fire. To some, she looked like an underdog cornered by a man with more power, more stature, more institutional weight. But to those who knew her story, the picture was clearer. This was not weakness. This was a woman who had faced down harder fights than this chamber could ever contain. This was a woman who understood that dignity was louder than arrogance, that composure was sharper than intimidation, and that truth had a way of cutting through even the most choreographed performance of authority. The room didn't know it yet, but the tide was shifting. Her stillness was not surrender. It was calculation. It was the patience of someone who knew that timing was everything, and that when her moment came, it would land like a hammer. That resilience was about to collide with the most intimidating challenge of her career, and the nation would be watching. The exchange began like a chess match, each move calculated, each question a piece pushed forward with deliberate force. Judge Thapar leaned into his microphone, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who believed the game was his to control. "Congresswoman," he pressed, "when your statements contradict the facts on record, how can the public trust your judgment?" His tone was sharp, clipped, the kind of delivery designed to rattle nerves and elicit missteps. Crockett didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she allowed the question to hang in the air, her eyes fixed on him, her expression calm, unreadable. The pause grew heavier with every second, so much so that it seemed to pull the oxygen from the chamber. Spectators shifted in their seats, uncertain whether they were witnessing hesitation or control. Thapar mistook her silence for weakness. He pushed further. "You speak of representing the people, but isn't it true your own record betrays their trust?" His words dripped with condescension, each one punctuated as though he were delivering a verdict. He sat back in his chair, with the air of someone confident that he had cornered his opponent. Still, Crockett remained composed. She tilted her head slightly, not in submission, but in the subtle way a seasoned player studies the board before making the move that changes everything. Her posture radiated patience, her stillness more powerful than any outburst could have been. The murmurs began to ripple across the gallery. Some smirked, convinced they were witnessing the unraveling of an unprepared congresswoman. Others leaned forward, sensing a tension building that they couldn't yet name. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing every flicker of expression, every bead of sweat forming along Thapar's temple. The judge's voice sharpened again, louder this time, betraying a growing impatience. Do you deny that your record shows inconsistencies? Answer the question directly. His brow furrowed. His hand gripped the edge of the table as though force alone might pull the response he demanded. Crockett's composure contrasted starkly with his agitation. Where he grew more animated, she remained a still figure, grounded and unshaken. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft enough to force the room into silence, yet steady enough to command it. "Judge, are you asking me a question?" she said evenly. "Or are you trying to lecture me?" A ripple of reaction swept through the room. Some gasped, others chuckled under their breath. Thapar blinked, momentarily thrown off balance, but quickly recovered with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Don't evade, Congresswoman. The people deserve clarity, not theatrics." But the irony was apparent. His voice was louder now, his gestures broader, his composure fraying at the edges. The very performance designed to show dominance was beginning to look like desperation. Crockett, in contrast, seemed untouchable, her calm and unspoken rebuke to every ounce of bluster he brought to the exchange. The pauses grew more dramatic. After every accusation, every pointed barb, she let the silence stretch just long enough to remind the room that she was not rattled. The audience began to notice the contrast. A man growing restless, a woman unmoved. Each passing moment shifted the weight of the confrontation, slowly but unmistakably, away from the judge who thought he had already won. Thapar pressed on, his voice now carrying the faint edge of frustration. "So you refuse to answer directly? Is that what we're to expect from our representatives?" His words echoed, but they no longer struck with the same force. The crowd wasn't just listening to what he said, they were watching how he said it. And what they saw was a man losing control. Crockett met his gaze, unblinking. The silence that followed was longer this time, more deliberate. The tension was unbearable, the kind of moment that made even seasoned reporters grip their pens tighter. The chamber seemed suspended in that stillness, waiting for the next move. And then came the line that froze everyone in place. The silence stretched, heavy as a held breath. Judge Thapar leaned forward, his lips parting to press her again, certain he had finally cornered his opponent. But Jasmine Crockett moved first. Her voice broke the tension with a calm steadiness that cut through the chamber like glass shattering on marble. "You've asked me about inconsistencies, Judge," she began, her words slow, deliberate. "But if we're going to talk about contradictions, maybe we should start with yours." The crowd stirred instantly. Reporters' heads snapped up, pens scratched hurriedly against notepads. It wasn't a defensive reply, it was an opening salvo. Crockett's eyes never wavered as she leaned in, her tone not louder, but sharper, as if every syllable had been honed beforehand. On one hand, you present yourself as the guardian of integrity, demanding accountability from those of us who serve in Congress, and yet on the other, your own record tells a different story. She paused, letting the words settle. The pause wasn't hesitation, it was design. Every camera lens tightened in anticipation. Thapar shifted in his chair, his jaw clenched. Crockett continued, her rhythm controlled. "You've spoken about transparency as though it were sacred. But how many times have your financial disclosures been questioned? How many rulings have raised eyebrows because of ties that weren't made clear? You ask me about consistency, Judge, but perhaps the real question is, who are you to lecture anyone about trust?" Gasps rippled through the audience. A murmur swelled, rolling across the room like a wave. Even those who came expecting her defeat straightened in their seats, caught off guard by the audacity of her counterstrike. She pressed further, her tone unwavering. You've spent your career mastering intimidation, leaning on your robe, your title, your bench. But outside the courtroom, those tactics don't silence people. Out here, they expose you. Because authority without humility isn't strength, Judge. It's weakness dressed in robes. The line landed like a hammer. For a moment, the chamber felt electrified. Spectators exchanged wide-eyed glances. A smattering of applause erupted before being quickly hushed, but the damage was done. The room's energy had shifted. Thapar blinked rapidly, caught between indignation and disbelief. His lips pressed together in a thin line, as if weighing whether to strike back or retreat. But before he could gather his words, Crockett spoke again, softer now, measured, her composure unshaken. You wanted to paint me as unprepared, as someone who didn't belong here. But Judge, I've stood in courtrooms defending people who had nothing, no power, no privilege, no one on their side. And I learned something you never did. When you fight for truth, you don't need theatrics. You just need courage. The silence that followed was deafening. Cameras clicked furiously, trying to capture the precise instant Thapar's expression shifted from confidence to something closer to panic. His fingers tapped against the desk, betraying nerves. For the first time, his weapon, intimidation, had failed him. The audience's reaction was impossible to contain. A low rumble of voices filled the chamber, some whispering in disbelief, others grinning at the sight of a giant being cut down to size. One young observer in the gallery mouthed the words, "Oh my God," to her friend, while another shook his head, smiling as though he had just witnessed history. Crockett, however, didn't bask in the moment. She didn't raise her voice or smile smugly. Instead, she folded her hands calmly in front of her, as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. Her composure was its own mic drop, the unspoken message that she didn't need applause to validate her truth. Thapar, desperate to regain control, leaned into his microphone. "Congresswoman, with all due respect," but the crowd wasn't listening to him anymore. His words fell flat, swallowed by the weight of Crockett's rebuttal. Even his body betrayed him. The slight shake in his voice, the stiffness in his posture, the way his eyes darted toward the cameras as though he knew the optics were slipping beyond his grasp. Crockett waited. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush. She let him flounder, the silence between his broken phrases growing louder than his words. When he finally trailed off, she leaned forward, her voice steady. "You can try to corner me, Judge, but you'll never silence me, because I don't answer to intimidation. I answer to the people who sent me here." The line landed with finality. It was the kind of sentence that didn't need explanation, the kind that echoed because it was built on truth. The murmurs rose again, this time punctuated by audible gasps and scattered claps. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they had just witnessed the clip that would dominate every evening broadcast. Thapar sat frozen. For once, the man who prided himself on rapid-fire questioning had no words. His silence was louder than any argument he could have made, and in that silence, Crockett didn't gloat. She simply straightened her posture, her face calm, her eyes steady, embodying the dignity that had carried her from grassroots beginnings to this very moment. She didn't need to crush him with volume. She had dismantled him with composure. The room knew it. The cameras knew it. And though Thapar tried to mask it, even he knew it. The hearing went on, the formalities continuing, but the energy had shifted irreversibly. The audience no longer leaned in to watch him perform. They leaned in to witness her resilience. His unraveling was quiet but undeniable. The clipped answers, the forced smiles, the way his shoulders seemed heavier than when the exchange began. Jasmine Crockett had turned the trap inside out. The predator had become the prey, and the underdog had claimed the stage. But the real explosion was waiting online. The exchange had barely ended before the internet lit up. Within minutes, hashtags surged across Twitter. Judge Crockett clap back. Mic drop moment. Judge Thapar shutdown. Screens across the country buzzed as clips of the moment spread like wildfire. TikTok edits stitched the highlight into rapid cuts, overlaying dramatic music, slow-motion replays, and captions like, "This is how you dismantle arrogance." On Instagram, Reels looped the instant Crockett delivered her line about authority without humility, each replayed with thunderous sound effects and applause tracks. By the end of the hour, the confrontation wasn't just a political moment. It was a cultural event. One clip alone racked up over 2 million views before the sun had set, comments pouring in from across the spectrum. "This is why representation matters," one user wrote. Another chimed in, "She didn't just win an argument. She embodied dignity." Memes, too, were unstoppable. Thapar's stunned silence became a template, his frozen face edited onto stills of malfunctioning robots, his gavel replaced with an error 404 sign, his jaw dropped into GIFs captioned, "When you realize the underdog just cooked you." Mainstream journalists picked it up quickly. Cable news anchors replayed the clip in prime-time slots, dissecting every pause, every camera angle, every flicker of Thapar's expression. Opinion pieces rolled out overnight. "Crockett redefines calm in the face of power," one headline declared. Another was even blunter. "Judge Thapar got schooled," and celebrities weren't silent either. A-list actors retweeted the clip with fire emojis. Musicians posted it on their Instagram stories, pairing it with the word iconic. Even late-night comedians, always hungry for material, built their opening monologues around the moment, splicing in laugh tracks whenever Thapar's expression faltered. The contrast in reception was glaring. For Crockett, the celebration felt tidal. Fans called her the embodiment of grace under pressure, a voice for communities often sidelined. Young activists praised her for showing that intelligence and dignity could overpower arrogance and intimidation. Parents shared clips with their children, captioning them with lines like, "This is how you stand tall." For Thapar, however, the internet was less forgiving. Commentators mocked his overconfidence, replaying his failed attempt to corner Crockett as evidence of hubris backfiring. Critics labeled his approach condescending, outdated, and emblematic of a style of power no longer tolerated. His defenders tried to salvage dignity in op-eds and thread-long explanations, but the narrative had already crystallized. The judge had been outmaneuvered, and the world saw it. Beyond the noise, though, something deeper stirred. Social media was more than entertainment in this case. It became validation. Immigrants, women of color, and underdogs from all walks of life watched Crockett hold her ground and felt themselves reflected in her poise. The ripple effect was powerful. Stories poured into comment sections, tales of people confronting authority. At work, in school, or in their communities, now armed with a sense of possibility. One viral tweet summed it up. "She didn't just shut him down, she showed us all that dignity wins." The resonance spread offline, too. Community groups organized watch parties, replaying the clip as though it were a victory in sports. Students brought it into classrooms as an example of rhetorical strength. Ministers referenced it in sermons about justice and humility. Crockett's words weren't just an answer in a hearing. They had become a rallying cry. Meanwhile, Thapar's silence became its own character in the story. Commentators pointed out that his inability to respond spoke louder than anything he might have said. The still frame of him blinking, stunned, searching, became a symbol of arrogance meeting its match. The country was watching, not just as an audience to political theater, but as participants in a conversation about who gets to hold power and how it should be wielded. Crockett, by standing firm, had shifted the narrative, and Thapar, by leaning too heavily on intimidation, had been reduced from authority to cautionary tale, yet beneath the noise, a deeper lesson was resonating. In the days that followed, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's rebuttal stopped being just a political highlight. It became a parable. People weren't replaying it merely to watch a judge stumble or a congresswoman shine. They were replaying it because it revealed something bigger, something that transcended one hearing. At its heart, this wasn't a story about clever phrasing or courtroom theatrics. It was about courage, standing in the face of intimidation. Crockett had embodied the truth that dignity outlasts arrogance, that composure speaks louder than bluster. When authority is wielded like a weapon, it will always crumble against the steady force of truth. And in that moment, the underdog proved it for the world to see. Her calm presence was more than personal triumph. It was symbolic of a cultural shift long in the making. For generations, people in power relied on titles, robes, and positions to silence dissenting voices. But Crockett's moment was a reminder that we're living in a new era, one where the measure of leadership isn't intimidation, but integrity. She showed that real strength isn't found in loudness, but in steadiness. Not in arrogance, but in humility. For countless viewers, her response was validation. Immigrants saw in her a reflection of the grit it takes to survive in unfamiliar systems. Women saw the power of holding ground when expectations say you should bow. Young activists saw the blueprint for how to confront those who dismiss or belittle them. And ordinary people saw proof that composure, clarity, and courage could topple intimidation in their own lives. It's easy to believe that the powerful are untouchable, that their dominance is unshakable. But Crockett's composure cracked that illusion. Her moment was not just political theater, it was an instruction that anyone, no matter their background, can rise above arrogance by clinging to truth. That silence, when chosen with purpose, can be louder than 1,000 shouted accusations. That dignity, once revealed, cannot be taken back. The lesson was simple, but profound. We don't need to match arrogance with arrogance. We don't need to mirror intimidation with fear. The true counterstrike is calmness rooted in conviction. And when wielded with patience and precision, it can dismantle even the most intimidating opponent. Jasmine Crockett's moment in that chamber was more than a rebuttal. It was a rallying cry. A reminder that power belongs not to those who try to dominate the stage, but to those who stand firm in their truth. And the world, watching, felt it. Because this wasn't just about one hearing, it was about all of us. Judge Amul Thapar tried to corner Jasmine Crockett, but she shut him down instantly and the world saw it. What began as a trap meant to humiliate her ended as a defining moment that revealed the power of dignity over arrogance. One woman's composure dismantled an entire performance of intimidation, and in doing so, she reminded millions of us that truth doesn't need theatrics. It simply needs courage. This wasn't just a viral clip. It was proof that arrogance, no matter how loud, can never outlast dignity. It was proof that resilience, born from lived struggle, is stronger than the posturing of authority. And it was proof that when someone stands tall in their truth, they don't just defend themselves, they inspire countless others to do the same. So let this moment be more than a memory. Let it be fuel. Fuel for every time you've been underestimated, silenced or dismissed. Fuel to remember that calm conviction can silence even the sharpest arrogance. And fuel to believe that your voice, too, carries the weight of truth. If moments like this remind you why truth matters, why courage inspires, and why dignity must always rise above arrogance, then join us. Subscribe, share this story, and be part of a community that celebrates resilience and demands justice. Because the fight for dignity is bigger than one hearing, one judge, or one congresswoman. It's about all of us. And together, we can keep amplifying the moments that show the world exactly what happens when truth refuses to bow.